My name is Claire. I sat at my meticulously organized stainless steel laboratory workbench, peering through a 10-power magnification jeweler's loupe. Held delicately in the grip of my titanium tweezers was a massive 3.2-carat, round, brilliant cut stone. Under the harsh, focused beam of the halogen benchlight, the stone exploded with a blinding, kaleidoscopic fire. It cast fractured rainbows across the white walls of my office. To the untrained naked eye, it looked exactly like a flawless $100,000 diamond. But it wasn't a diamond. It was a piece of synthetic, lab-grown moissanite. It was a molecular replica, a highly refractive piece of silicon carbide that was essentially worthless on the high-end secondary market. At that exact moment, my mother-in-law, Beatrice, was sitting in a windowless holding cell at the downtown police precinct. She was wearing a sequined designer gown. Her mascara was streaked down her face, and she was facing multiple felony charges for criminal fraud. She was sitting in that cell because she had tried to sell this exact stone to an underground broker to pay off her illegal gambling debts, entirely convinced that she was holding my priceless family heirloom. Beatrice thought she was a master manipulator. She thought she could bully me, use my husband as a weapon against me, and steal my family's legacy to cover her own toxic mistakes. But Beatrice made one fatal, incredibly arrogant miscalculation. She forgot that I am a professional gemologist. I do not work at a mall jewelry kiosk selling engagement rings to nervous young men. I am a senior appraiser for one of the most elite, exclusive international auction houses in New York City. My entire professional life is dedicated to the precise, unforgiving science of carbon, light, and pressure. I analyze the molecular structure of the world's most expensive gemstones. I authenticate historical pieces owned by European royalty, and I detect the most sophisticated, microscopic counterfeits on the planet. In my world, there is no room for sentimentality or optical illusions. We grade diamonds on the strict absolute criteria of the 4 C's: carat, cut, color, and clarity. I use thermal conductivity probes to measure how heat travels through a stone's crystal lattice. I use heavy liquid specific gravity testing. I use spectroscopes to analyze the exact wavelength of light, absorbed by trace elements within a gem. I know exactly how to differentiate between a billion-year-old natural diamond pulled from the earth and a piece of high-grade cubic zirconia baked in a laboratory oven for 3 weeks. I deal exclusively in molecular truth, which is why I understood the true absolute value of the heirloom ring. The ring was not just a piece of jewelry. It was the physical embodiment of my family's survival. The center stone was a true anomaly of nature, a 3.2-carat, D color, internally flawless, ideal cut natural diamond. A D color rating means the stone is completely, utterly colorless, lacking even the faintest microscopic trace of yellow nitrogen. It is the rarest and most valuable color grade in existence. The diamond originally belonged to my great-grandmother. During the height of the Second World War, as the borders of Europe were collapsing into chaos and violence, she took the diamond out of its original setting and sewed it deep into the heavy wool lining of her winter coat. She smuggled that stone across 3 international borders, surviving freezing winters and terrifying interrogations, until she finally secured passage on a ship to the United States. She used the diamond as her ultimate insurance policy, a guarantee that her family would never starve in a new world. She eventually passed it down to my grandmother, who passed it to my mother, who passed it to me on my wedding day. In the current high-end auction market, considering the stone's flawless grading and historical provenance, I had personally appraised its value at $120,000. I never kept the ring in my house. I am not a fool. The ring resided in a highly secure, climate-controlled safety deposit box at a private bank in Manhattan, protected by biometric scanners and dual key protocols. I only wore it once a year, on my wedding anniversary, and then immediately returned it to the vault. My husband, Greg, knew how much the ring meant to me. Greg was a good man in many respects, but he possessed a fatal character flaw that slowly poisoned our marriage over the years. He was pathologically conflict avoidant. He worked as a mid-level human resources manager for a corporate logistics firm, and his entire life philosophy was based on keeping his head down and avoiding arguments. Whenever his mother, Beatrice, caused drama, crossed boundaries, or acted outrageously, Greg's default response was to beg me to just keep the peace. He would rather sacrifice my emotional well-being and my boundaries than face the uncomfortable task of standing up to his own mother, and Beatrice required a lot of standing up to. My mother-in-law was a textbook narcissist who was entirely obsessed with the illusion of high society status. She lived in a massive, 5-bedroom colonial house in an expensive suburb, drove a brand-new, leased Mercedes SUV, and belonged to an exclusive country club she visited almost daily. She wore Chanel suits and spoke with a manufactured, aristocratic drawl that she had copied from old movies. But it was all a facade. Beatrice was secretly, hopelessly drowning in debt. I knew this because, unlike Greg, I actually paid attention to details. I noticed the multiple past due notices stacked on her kitchen counter when we visited. I noticed that she constantly opened new high-interest credit cards. But her darkest secret, the one that threatened to completely destroy her carefully curated life, was her severe gambling addiction. Beatrice wasn't just playing penny slots at the local casino. She was involved in high-stakes, underground poker games and illegal sports betting rings, run by very dangerous people in the city. 2 years ago, during a family Christmas party, Beatrice had gotten incredibly drunk on expensive wine and passed out on our guest room bed. Her purse spilled onto the floor, and her burner cell phone fell out, the screen lighting up with a series of terrifying text messages from an unsaved number. The messages were aggressive demands for a $30,000 payment, threatening physical violence if she didn't clear her ledger by the end of the month. I showed the messages to Greg, expecting him to confront his mother and stage an intervention. Instead, Greg panicked. He deleted the messages, shoved the phone back into her purse, and begged me to pretend I hadn't seen anything. He claimed she was just going through a phase, and that confronting her would only humiliate her and tear the family apart. He chose the illusion of peace over the reality of the crisis. I stayed quiet, but I never forgot what I saw. I knew that Beatrice was a desperate woman, and desperate people are capable of horrific betrayals. The betrayal began on a rainy Sunday evening in late October. We were sitting in Beatrice's overly decorated, formal dining room, finishing a dinner of dry roast beef and instant mashed potatoes. Beatrice tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver fork to get our attention. "I have a very important announcement," Beatrice proclaimed, sitting up straight and adjusting her pearl necklace. "Next month is the annual Autumn Charity Gala at the Country Club. It is the most exclusive event of the season. The mayor will be there. The governor might even make an appearance, and I have been asked to host the primary fundraising table." "That's great, Mom," Greg said immediately, eager to offer his supportive validation. "Yes, it is," Beatrice agreed, taking a slow sip of her wine. Then she turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and cold, and because I will be representing the Vance family on such a prestigious public stage, it is only appropriate that I look the part. Therefore, Claire, I will need you to retrieve the heirloom diamond from your little bank vault. I will be wearing it to the gala." The room went completely silent. I stopped chewing my food. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate, feeling the cold steel against my fingers. She didn't ask to borrow it. She didn't frame it as a favor. She demanded it, as if she were a queen requisitioning property from a peasant. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "The diamond ring, Claire," Beatrice repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. "The 3-carat piece your grandmother smuggled. It is a stunning stone, even if the platinum setting is a bit outdated. It is a matriarch's right to wear the finest family jewels at high society events. It shows the world our pedigree. I will need it by the first week of November, so I can have my jeweler polish it. Absolutely not, I replied instantly, without a millisecond of hesitation. Beatrice's eyes widened in genuine shock. She wasn't used to being told no. What did you just say to me? I said no, Beatrice, I stated clearly, looking her dead in the eye. That ring is not a costume prop for a country club party. It is a $120,000 historical artifact. Furthermore, it is not a Vance family jewel. It belongs to my bloodline. My great-grandmother risked her life to save it. It stays in the biometric vault, where it is fully insured and completely secure. The facade of the elegant, high society woman vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious, entitled narcissist lurking underneath. Beatrice slammed her hands down on the mahogany dining table, her face flushing a dark, angry red. "How dare you?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "You sit at my table, eating my food, and you disrespect me like this? You selfish, materialistic little girl. I am the head of this family. That ring should have been given to me the day you married my son. It belongs to the family name now." "It belongs to me," I countered, my voice remaining entirely calm, which only infuriated her more. Beatrice burst into dramatic, hysterical tears. She covered her face with her linen napkin, sobbing loudly. She looked at Greg, weaponizing her tears exactly the way she had done his entire life. "Greg, do you see how she treats me?" Beatrice wailed. "She hates me. She thinks she's better than us because of her fancy job in the city. I just wanted to look nice for one night. I just wanted to feel special. And she spits in my face." Greg looked panicked. His eyes darted between his sobbing mother and my cold, unyielding expression. The conflict-avoidant programming kicked in immediately. "Claire, can we talk in the kitchen?" Greg whispered urgently, standing up from his chair. I sighed, stood up, and followed him through the swinging door into the kitchen. The moment the door closed, Greg turned to me, his hands pleading. "Claire, please," Greg begged, his voice hushed and frantic. "Just let her wear the ring. It's just for one night. She's hosting the most important table at the gala. It means the world to her." "Greg, are you out of your mind?" I hissed, staring at him in disbelief. "It's a flawless, D-colored diamond worth over $100,000. I'm not letting her parade around a country club drinking martinis with it. She's careless. What if she loses it? What if someone steals it?" "She won't lose it," Greg argued, running a hand through his hair. "I'll be right there with her. I'll watch her the whole night. Claire, look at her in there. She's crying. You're tearing the family apart over a piece of jewelry. You're being incredibly selfish. Just give her the ring and keep the peace." I stared at my husband. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my partner, realizing that he was perfectly willing to risk the most valuable, sentimental object in my life just to avoid a minor argument with his toxic mother. He was gaslighting me, calling me selfish for protecting my own family's legacy. But worse than Greg's cowardice was the sudden, terrifying realization that hit me as I thought about Beatrice's aggressive, non-negotiable demand. Beatrice didn't want to wear the ring to the gala. She wanted the physical asset. She was drowning in illegal gambling debts to violent loan sharks. If she had my ring in her possession, she wouldn't wear it to a party. She would take it straight to an underground broker, use it as collateral for a massive loan, and pay off her bookies to save her own life. She knew that once the ring was gone, Greg would defend her, claiming it was an accident, and I would be left with nothing but an empty bank vault and a devastated family legacy. She was trying to steal from me to save herself. A cold, absolute fury settled into my chest, the kind of anger that doesn't scream or throw plates, but quietly calculates the exact trajectory of total destruction. "Okay, Greg," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You're right, I'm being unreasonable. Tell your mother she can have the ring for the gala. I'll get it out of the vault next week." Greg exhaled a massive sigh of relief, smiling weakly. "Thank you, Claire. I promise everything will be fine." He walked back into the dining room to comfort his mother. I stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the stainless steel refrigerator. I had agreed to give Beatrice the ring. But I never said which ring I was going to give her. Have you ever had a manipulative family member demand access to your personal property or finances using a weak partner or family loyalty as a weapon against you? Did you hold your boundaries, or did you figure out a way to turn the trap back on them? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. The next morning, I did not go to the private bank in Manhattan to retrieve my great-grandmother's ring. I left the actual heirloom sitting safely in its biometric, climate-controlled vault. Instead, I took the subway down to the Diamond District on 47th Street. The Diamond District is a chaotic, high-security ecosystem of wholesale brokers, master setters, and gem cutters. It is an industry built entirely on trust and reputation. Because of my position at the auction house, I had access to resources that the general public could never dream of touching. I walked into a heavily secured second-floor workshop owned by a master setter named Yuri, a man I had worked with for a decade. He specialized in restoring antique European mountings. I didn't ask him to restore anything today. I asked him to build a forgery. I handed Yuri a high-resolution photograph of my heirloom ring. "I need an exact replica of this setting," I told him, "but I don't want platinum. Cast it in cheap 14-karat white gold. And rhodium plate it heavily so it looks expensive." Yuri examined the photograph through his loupe, noting the intricate filigree work on the band. "I can cast the mold by tomorrow. What are we setting in the center?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out a small, folded piece of parcel paper. Inside was a 3.2-carat, round, brilliant cut stone. It was a piece of synthetic moissanite. To the untrained eye, moissanite is indistinguishable from a natural diamond. In fact, because of its unique crystalline structure, moissanite actually has a higher refractive index and a significantly higher dispersion rate than a diamond. In layman's terms, it creates more fire. When light hits it, it flashes with aggressive, disco ball-like rainbows. To a professional gemologist, that excessive rainbow fire is a dead giveaway that the stone is a cheap synthetic. But to a status-obsessed narcissist, like Beatrice, who equated flashiness with wealth, that extra sparkle would just convince her that she was holding the most expensive object she had ever touched in her life. The moissanite stone cost me roughly $500. The white gold setting cost $300. For $800, I had manufactured a perfectly convincing replica of a $120,000 historical artifact. 3 days later, Yuri handed me the finished replica. I placed it inside an old, slightly worn blue velvet box to complete the illusion. I also took one extra precaution. Using a pair of tweezers and a dab of industrial adhesive, I secured a microscopic, coin-sized GPS tracking chip deep underneath the velvet lining of the box. If Beatrice was going to pawn my heirloom to illegal bookies, I wanted to know exactly where she was taking it. I invited Beatrice and Greg over to our apartment that Sunday evening for dinner. I wanted the handover to be an official, documented event. After dinner, as Greg was clearing the plates, I walked into the bedroom and retrieved the blue velvet box. I walked back into the living room and handed it to Beatrice. "Here," I said, my voice completely flat, as requested. Beatrice's eyes lit up with a greedy, feverish intensity. She snatched the box from my hands with terrifying speed. She didn't even say thank you. She popped the lid open. The moissanite caught the light from our living room chandelier and exploded with brilliant, flashy rainbows. Beatrice gasped loudly, her hands actually trembling. She pulled the fake ring from the velvet slot and slid it onto her finger. "Oh, my word," Beatrice whispered, holding her hand out to admire the stone. "It is breathtaking. The fire in this stone, it's incredible. It looks like it belongs to royalty." Greg walked back into the living room, a massive smile of relief washing over his face. He looked at me, completely convinced that he had successfully managed the situation. He thought he had kept the peace. He thought I had submitted to the family hierarchy. "See Claire?" Greg said, putting his arm around my shoulder. "That wasn't so hard, was it? It looks beautiful on her. She's going to be the star of the gala." "I am sure she will attract a lot of attention," I replied smoothly, looking directly at Beatrice. "But you need to be extremely careful with that, Beatrice. It is incredibly valuable. If anything happens to it, there will be severe consequences." Beatrice laughed, a high, dismissive sound. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Claire. I'm just wearing it to a country club. It will be perfectly safe on my finger. You worry too much." She didn't take the ring off. She wore it for the rest of the evening, constantly admiring her reflection in the windows, acting as if the cheap piece of silicon carbide had suddenly elevated her to the status of a billionaire matriarch. When they finally left, she placed the ring carefully back into the bugged velvet box and placed it inside her designer purse. The charity gala was scheduled for a Saturday evening, 2 weeks away. Beatrice didn't even wait 48 hours. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting in my laboratory at the auction house, authenticating a suite of vintage emeralds, when an alert pinged on my smartphone. I opened the tracking app. The GPS chip inside the velvet box was moving. It wasn't moving toward a high-end jeweler to be polished. It wasn't moving toward the country club. The blue dot on my screen was traveling rapidly away from Beatrice's wealthy suburb and heading directly into a deeply commercial, slightly rundown district on the edge of the city. I zoomed in on the map. The tracker came to a stop in front of a heavily barred, neon-lit storefront called Gold and Diamond Exchange. It was an underground pawn shop. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions about provenance or ownership. The kind of place where desperate people brought stolen goods for quick, untraceable cash payouts, usually to settle illegal debts. My suspicion was absolutely confirmed. Beatrice was pawning the ring. She was attempting to liquidate my family's legacy to pay off her loan sharks. A normal person might have panicked. A normal person might have called Greg, screaming that his mother was stealing from them. I didn't call Greg. I didn't want to stop Beatrice. I wanted her to commit to the crime fully. But I also knew something about that specific pawn shop that Beatrice, in her desperate arrogance, did not know. Because of my role as a senior appraiser, I frequently coordinated with the New York Police Department's Major Case Squad, specifically the Jewelry and Art Theft Division. They often consulted me when they recovered stolen gems from high-profile robberies. I knew the detectives well, and I knew that Gold and Diamond Exchange was currently the central target of a massive, ongoing, undercover federal sting operation. The police suspected the owner was fencing stolen goods for international syndicates. I picked up my secure office phone. I dialed a direct number I had memorized. "Detective Miller," a gruff voice answered. "Miller, it's Claire Vance at the auction house," I said smoothly. "Claire," the detective replied, his tone shifting to professional respect. "What do you have for us today? Someone trying to auction off a stolen Picasso?" "Not quite," I said, "but I have a highly reliable tip regarding a potential high-value fraudulent transaction occurring right now. An older woman, mid-60s, blonde hair, carrying a blue velvet box, just walked into the Gold and Diamond Exchange on 8th Avenue. I paused, letting the significance of the location sink in. "The exchange?" Miller asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "We have an undercover unit sitting outside that place right now, monitoring a wire. What's the woman trying to move?" "She believes she is pawning a flawlessly cut, 3-carat natural diamond valued well over $100,000. I explained. "However, she does not legally own the stone, and more importantly, the stone is a synthetic forgery. She is attempting to defraud a suspected fence for a massive cash payout. If your undercover guys move in right now, you can catch her in the act of committing felony commercial fraud. Fraud over 100 grand is a Class C felony, Miller noted, the sound of a radio crackling in the background. You're sure about this, Claire? I'm positive, I replied. I'm the one who appraised the original. Understood. I'm dispatching the tactical unit to breach the storefront. We'll take her down alongside the owner. Thanks for the tip, Claire. The line went dead. I hung up the phone, picked up my tweezers, and went back to examining my emeralds. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the steel jaws were about to snap shut. Meanwhile, across the city, Beatrice was living out her own personal crime thriller. I can perfectly visualize the scene based on the police report I read later. Beatrice walked into the dimly lit pawn shop, her heart undoubtedly pounding against her ribs. She was terrified of the loan sharks, but she was also incredibly arrogant. She walked up to the thick, bulletproof glass counter and demanded to speak to the owner. When the owner, a heavy-set man with a suspected mob affiliation, came to the counter, Beatrice slid the blue velvet box under the glass partition. I need a short-term, collateralized loan, Beatrice announced, trying to sound like a sophisticated socialite rather than a desperate gambling addict. $50,000 in cash. I'm leaving this as collateral. The owner opened the box. Even in the poor lighting of the shop, the moissanite flared with excessive, blinding fire. The owner, who was a criminal but not a trained gemologist, pulled out a cheap electronic diamond tester. Here is the fatal flaw in Beatrice's plan, and the brilliant trap of moissanite. Cheap, handheld diamond testers measure thermal conductivity. Because moissanite conducts heat very similarly to a natural diamond, it frequently registers as a real diamond on low-end testing equipment. The tester beeped green. The owner looked at the massive stone, looked at the desperate, wealthy-looking woman standing in front of him, and realized he was looking at the score of a lifetime. He believed he was taking a $100,000 stone for a $50,000 payout. 50 grand, the owner grunted. Cash. Give me 5 minutes to pull it from the safe in the back. Beatrice smiled. A wave of profound relief washed over her. She thought she had done it. She thought she had successfully manipulated her stupid daughter-in-law, secured the cash, and saved her own life. She imagined taking the stack of $100 bills straight to her bookie, wiping the slate clean, and returning to her country club life as if nothing had ever happened. But Beatrice didn't get to touch the money. Before the owner could return from the back room, the front doors of the pawn shop shattered. NYPP, nobody move. Get your hands on the counter. A team of heavily armed, tactical, undercover detectives swarmed the shop. They poured through the front entrance, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. The owner tried to run out the back door, but he was immediately tackled by 2 officers and slammed into the concrete floor. Beatrice shrieked in absolute terror. She dropped her designer purse and threw her hands over her head. An officer grabbed her by the arm, spun her around, and slammed her against the bulletproof glass counter, forcefully cuffing her wrists behind her back. "What are you doing?" Beatrice screamed, her aristocratic facade completely shattering. She was crying hysterically, struggling against the cuffs. "Get your hands off me. I am a respected member of this community. I haven't done anything wrong. I was just pawning a family ring." Detective Miller walked into the shop, holstering his weapon. He walked over to the counter and picked up the blue velvet box. He looked at the massive, fiery stone sitting inside. Then he looked at Beatrice. "You're pawning a family ring?" Miller asked, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "Ma'am, you are standing in a known fencing operation for international syndicates. We received a direct tip that you are attempting to defraud this establishment by selling a synthetic counterfeit gemstone for $50,000. Counterfeit?" Beatrice gasped, her face turning pale. No, you don't understand. That is a flawless 3-carat natural diamond. It's worth over $100,000. My daughter-in-law gave it to me. It's a family heirloom." Sure it is, lady, Miller scoffed, snapping the velvet box shut. And I'm the Queen of England. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. They marched her out of the shop in handcuffs, right past a crowd of onlookers on the sidewalk. They pushed her into the back of a police cruiser. Her carefully constructed illusion of wealth, status, and superiority was completely annihilated in the span of 3 minutes. She was officially booked at the downtown precinct on charges of felony, attempted grand larceny, and criminal fraud. Because the transaction exceeded $50,000, she wasn't given a desk appearance ticket. She was placed in a holding cell with accused drug dealers and violent offenders, wearing her expensive clothes, completely stripped of her power. That is when I received the phone call. Have you ever watched a greedy, manipulative person walk perfectly into a trap they dug themselves because they were completely blinded by their own arrogance? Did they try to blame you when the trap snapped shut? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. I was sitting at my desk, quietly cataloging a collection of Victorian-era sapphires, when my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the metal surface. It was Greg. I let it ring 3 times, allowing his panic to marinate, before finally answering. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice mild and professional. "Claire," Greg yelled. He sounded completely unhinged. I could hear the echo of a large, busy room in the background, punctuated by the distinct crackle of police radios. He was hyperventilating, his words tumbling over each other. "Claire, you have to get down here right now. It's my mother. It's a disaster." "Greg, slow down," I instructed calmly. "Get down where? What happened to Beatrice?" "She's been arrested," Greg shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'm at the downtown precinct. They raided a pawn shop, Claire. They arrested her and threw her in a holding cell. But that's not even the worst part. The police are saying she committed fraud. They're saying the diamond ring, the heirloom you gave her, they're saying it's a fake." "A fake?" I repeated, injecting exactly the right amount of shock and confusion into my voice. "Greg, that's impossible. It's a flawless 3-carat natural diamond. I appraised it myself." "I know," Greg pleaded desperately. I tried to tell them. I tried to tell the detectives that she's a wealthy woman and that the ring is a priceless family artifact. But they won't listen to me. They're treating her like a common criminal. "You have to come down here, Claire. You have to bring your credentials. You have to authenticate the ring for them and get her out of this." "I'm on my way," I said. I hung up the phone. I didn't rush. I carefully packed away my tools, locked the sapphire collection in the vault, and walked out of the auction house. I hailed a cab and enjoyed a quiet, peaceful 20-minute ride to the downtown precinct. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the police station, the atmosphere was chaotic. The precinct was buzzing with the aftermath of the massive sting operation. Uniformed officers were processing suspects, phones were ringing constantly, and the smell of stale coffee and sweat hung in the air. Greg was pacing frantically in the waiting area, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and his face was pale. The moment he saw me, he sprinted across the lobby and grabbed me by the shoulders. "Thank God," Greg gasped. "Claire, it's a nightmare. They have her in a cell with prostitutes and drug dealers. She's hysterical. You have to fix this." "Where is Detective Miller?" I asked, shrugging his hands off my shoulders. "Who?" Greg asked, confused. Before I could explain, Detective Miller walked out from the bullpen area. He spotted me immediately and gestured for us to follow him. He led us down a long hallway and into a stark, brightly lit interrogation room. A moment later, a uniformed officer escorted Beatrice into the room. The transformation was staggering. Just 3 days ago, Beatrice had been sitting in our living room, wearing Chanel, looking down her nose at me, while she demanded my family's legacy. Now, she looked completely destroyed. Her expensive blonde blowout was ruined. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in thick black streaks. She was wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit over her designer dress, her hands cuffed securely behind her back. She looked small, old, and utterly terrified. When Beatrice saw me, her eyes widened and a surge of furious, desperate energy shot through her. "Tell them!" Beatrice shrieked, lunging toward me before the officer forced her into a metal chair. "Tell these idiots the truth. Tell them that ring is worth over $100,000. Tell them I am not a criminal." "Take it easy, Mrs. Vance," Detective Miller warned, standing near the door. He turned to me, his expression perfectly stoic, completely hiding the fact that we had spoken on the phone just hours earlier. "Mrs. Vance, your husband claims that you are a professional gemologist and that you can authenticate the piece of jewelry your mother-in-law was attempting to pawn." "That is correct," I said. "I am a senior appraiser for an international auction house." Miller pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his pocket and dropped it onto the metal table. Inside the bag was the cheap 14-karat white gold replica setting, holding the massive, fiery moissanite stone. "Can you confirm, for the official record, if this is the diamond ring in question?" Miller asked. Greg leaned over the table, staring at the ring. "It is. That's it. That's the ring Claire gave her on Sunday. See, Detective? It's real. My mother didn't do anything wrong." I reached into my purse and pulled out my 10-power jeweler's loop. I didn't open the bag. I just held the plastic up to the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, pressed the loop to my eye, and examined the stone for exactly 5 seconds. I lowered the loop. I looked directly at Greg, and then I looked at Beatrice. "Detective," I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent room, "this is not my family heirloom." Greg froze. "What?" "This is a synthetic moissanite stone," I stated objectively, tapping the plastic bag. "The refractive dispersion is entirely wrong for a natural diamond. The cut is modern, not vintage. And the setting is rhodium-plated 14-karat white gold, not the solid platinum of my great-grandmother's ring. In the current retail market, the object inside this bag is worth approximately $800. "No," Greg whispered, shaking his head. "No, Claire. That can't be right." "Look again. That's the ring you gave her." "I am a senior appraiser." "Greg," I said coldly, "I do not need to look again. It is a fake." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I watched the gears turn in Beatrice's head. I watched as the absolute, horrifying realization crashed over her. She looked at my cold, unyielding expression, and she finally understood. She understood that I had known all along. "You!" Beatrice screamed, a sound so primal and full of rage that it made Greg flinch violently. She strained against the handcuffs, her face turning purple. "You set me up, you little bitch. You gave me a fake ring." "Mom, stop!" Greg yelled, entirely overwhelmed by the chaos. "Why would she give you a fake?" I turned to Greg, playing the role of the shocked, innocent victim with absolute perfection. I let a look of profound betrayal cross my face. "That's a very good question, Greg," I said, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "Why would I give her a fake?" I handed her the blue velvet box from the vault. I told her to be careful with it. But more importantly, why was your mother taking my priceless family heirloom to an underground criminal pawn shop in the middle of the day? I turned back to Beatrice, narrowing my eyes. "I thought you were taking the ring to your jeweler to have it polished for the country club gala, Beatrice. Isn't that what you told us? Why were you trying to pawn my great-grandmother's diamond?" Greg stared at his mother. The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. For 8 years, Greg had lived in a state of willful ignorance. He had protected his mother, made excuses for her toxic behavior, and blamed me for not keeping the peace. But he couldn't ignore this. The illusion was shattered. "Mom?" Greg asked, his voice shaking. "What were you doing at a pawn shop?" Beatrice looked at her son. She was cornered. She had been caught in a federal sting operation attempting to sell fraudulent jewelry. She couldn't lie her way out of this with tears and guilt trips. I needed the cash, Greg, Beatrice sobbed, finally breaking down completely. The aristocratic facade was gone. She was just a desperate, terrified addict. I owed money. A lot of money. They were threatening me. They said they were going to hurt me if I didn't pay them $50,000 by Friday. I didn't have a choice. You owed money to who? Greg demanded, his face turning red with a mixture of shock and anger. Bookies, she wailed, burying her face against the metal table, her cuffed hands useless behind her. I had a bad streak at the underground poker tables. I thought I could win it back, but I just kept losing. I was desperate. I just needed to borrow against the ring. I was going to get it back, Greg. I swear. I just needed time. Greg stepped back from the table as if he had been physically struck. The reality of who his mother truly was finally penetrated his thick skull. You stole from us, Greg whispered, his voice laced with absolute horror. You demanded Claire's heirloom. You lied to our faces, and you tried to pawn it to illegal loan sharks to cover your gambling debts. You were going to lose it forever. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, devastating realization. Claire, if you had given her the real ring, it would be gone. The police would have confiscated it as evidence in a fraud sting. We would have lost it. Yes, Greg, I said softly, driving the final nail into the coffin of his enabling behavior. We would have lost my family's legacy. Because you told me I was being selfish. Because you told me to just hand it over to keep the peace. You almost cost me everything to protect a woman who was actively robbing us. Greg collapsed into the second metal chair, burying his face in his hands. He was completely broken. Beatrice, however, wasn't done. True narcissists never stop fighting for their own survival, no matter how much damage they cause. Greg, please, Beatrice cried, looking at her devastated son. They're charging me with felony fraud. If I get convicted, I'll go to prison. I'll lose the house. I'll lose everything. You have to help me. You have to bail me out, and you have to pay off the loan sharks before they come after me. Pay them off with what? Greg shouted, finally snapping. We don't have $50,000 lying around, Mom. Your savings, Beatrice demanded, her greed entirely overriding any sense of shame. You and Claire have been saving for a down payment on a house. You have the money. You have to use it. I am your mother, Greg. You have to protect me. I stood silently by the door, watching the culmination of my revenge unfold. For years, I had watched Beatrice manipulate my husband. I had watched her drain his emotional energy, disrespect our boundaries, and act as if she were entitled to everything we owned. I had watched Greg fold under her pressure time and time again. But this time, the pressure was too much. The cost was too high. Beatrice had finally pushed her golden child past the breaking point. She had shown him the absolute, ugly truth of her addiction, and she was demanding that he sacrifice our future to save her from the consequences of her own criminal actions. Greg slowly lifted his head from his hands and stumps. He looked at his mother, sitting in the cheap orange jumpsuit, crying hysterically and demanding his money. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. When a master manipulator finally pushes an enabler too far, the resulting crash is often spectacular. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment someone finally woke up from a toxic family member's manipulation? Did they fight back, or did they just walk away? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Greg stood up from the metal chair. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked exhausted. The heavy, suffocating weight of 30 years of enabling and conflict avoidance seemed to physically drain out of him, all at once. I'm not paying them, Mom, Greg said softly. Beatrice stopped crying. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. What did you say? I said I am not paying them, Greg repeated, his voice gaining a slight edge of firmness I hadn't heard in years. Claire and I have been saving that money for 5 years to buy a home. We sacrificed vacations, dinners out, and our own comfort for that money. I am not going to hand it over to illegal loan sharks to cover your gambling debts, and I am certainly not posting bail for you. "You can't leave me in here," Beatrice shrieked, panic clawing its way back into her voice. "Greg, I am your mother. They are going to put me in federal prison. You have to protect me." "You didn't protect us," Greg replied coldly. "You demanded Claire's heirloom. You lied to my face. You were going to let a mob-connected pawnbroker walk away with $120,000 of my wife's property just to save your own skin. If Claire hadn't been smart enough to protect herself from you, we would have lost everything." Greg turned his back on her and walked toward the heavy steel door. "Call a public defender, Mom. And good luck." He opened the door and walked out of the interrogation room. I followed closely behind him, leaving Beatrice screaming his name in the sterile, fluorescent-lit box. The ride home was quiet. Greg didn't say much, but he held my hand tightly the entire way. It was the first time in our marriage that I felt he had truly chosen me over the toxic, suffocating loyalty he felt toward his mother. The consequences for Beatrice were swift, brutal, and intensely public. Because Greg refused to post her bail, Beatrice spent the entire weekend in the county holding facility. By Monday morning, the news of the massive underground pawn shop sting had hit the local papers. The police department, eager to showcase a major victory against organized crime fencing operations, released a detailed press statement. Beatrice's name, age, and wealthy suburban address were published alongside the details of her felony fraud charges. In Beatrice's world, public humiliation is a fate far worse than physical pain. By Tuesday, the prestigious country club she belonged to revoked her membership, citing a zero-tolerance policy for members involved in active felony criminal investigations. By Wednesday, her wealthy socialite friends had entirely ostracized her. They stopped returning her calls. They uninvited her from the autumn charity gala. The carefully curated, aristocratic illusion she had spent decades building was completely annihilated in the span of 72 hours. But the social fallout was nothing compared to the financial devastation. Because Beatrice was sitting in a jail cell, she missed the Friday deadline to pay the loan sharks. Illegal bookies do not care about police sting operations, and they certainly do not offer extensions. When Beatrice failed to deliver the $50,000 she owed, they moved against her assets. They didn't break her kneecaps. They were much more sophisticated than that. They placed an anonymous, terrifyingly detailed phone call to the financing company that held the lease on her luxury Mercedes SUV, informing them that the vehicle was being driven by an individual actively indicted for felony fraud. The financing company immediately invoked a morality and liability clause in her contract and repossessed the vehicle from her driveway in the middle of the night. Then, the loan sharks targeted her massive 5-bedroom colonial house. They knew she was heavily mortgaged. They began making aggressive, anonymous threats, forcing Beatrice to make a desperate, panicked decision. When she was finally released on a bail bond, secured by a sleazy, high-interest bail bondsman, Beatrice immediately listed her house for sale. She had to price it well below market value for a quick, all-cash closing just to generate enough liquid capital to pay off the loan sharks before they resorted to physical violence. She lost the house. She lost the car. She lost her status. When Beatrice finally stood before a criminal court judge 6 months later, she was a completely different woman. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap, off-the-rack suit. Her hair was graying at the roots. She looked small, defeated, and utterly broken. Her public defender negotiated a plea deal to keep her out of state prison. Because she was a first-time offender, and because the pawn shop owner was the primary target of the sting operation, the district attorney agreed to drop the charges from felony attempted grand larceny down to a severe misdemeanor count of commercial fraud. The judge accepted the plea, but he did not hide his disgust. "You attempted to defraud a business out of $50,000 using a synthetic counterfeit, Mrs. Vance," the judge stated, looking down at her from the bench. The fact that you were simultaneously attempting to steal what you believe to be a priceless heirloom from your own daughter-in-law speaks volumes about your character. You are a profoundly selfish woman. Beatrice was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay $15,000 in state fines, and she was mandated to attend weekly court-ordered gambling, addiction rehabilitation meetings for the duration of her probation. She moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the other side of the city. She had to take a job working as a receptionist at a dental office just to make rent. The woman who once demanded my diamonds so she could play queen at a country club gala was now answering phones for $15 an hour. The fallout for Greg and me, however, was incredibly positive. The shock of his mother's betrayal finally shattered the deep-seated enabling programming Greg had suffered from his entire life. He realized that avoiding conflict didn't create peace. It only allowed toxic people to escalate their abuse until they destroyed everything. Greg started attending therapy. He worked through the guilt and the manipulation his mother had instilled in him. He learned how to set hard boundaries, and more importantly, he learned how to enforce them. Our marriage, which had been slowly suffocating under the weight of Beatrice's constant demands, finally had room to breathe. We used the money we had saved. The money Beatrice tried to steal to pay her bookies, to buy a beautiful, historic brownstone in Brooklyn. A year after the arrest, on our wedding anniversary, Greg took me to a Michelin-starred restaurant in the city to celebrate. Before we left the apartment, I went into my secure home safe. I pulled out a heavy platinum setting. I slipped the ring onto my finger. The real, 3.2-carat, D-color, flawless diamond caught the warm light of the restaurant chandelier. It flashed with a pure, brilliant natural fire that a piece of synthetic moissanite could never replicate. Greg reached across the table and took my hand, looking at the ring and then looking at me. "It's beautiful," Greg said softly. "I'm so sorry I ever asked you to risk it." "It's safe now," I replied, smiling. "It will always be safe." I won. I protected my family's legacy, I secured my financial future, and I orchestrated the spectacular downfall of a woman who thought she could use me as collateral for her own toxic mistakes. But I know my method of revenge is polarizing. Some people will say that my actions were completely justified. They will argue that Beatrice was a thief, a gambling addict, and a manipulator who dug her own grave the moment she demanded my property to pay off illegal loan sharks. They will say that she got exactly what she deserved when the police slapped the cuffs on her. But others will argue that I went too far. They will point out that by giving her a fake diamond and letting her walk into an underground pawn shop, I knowingly placed her in severe physical danger. If the police sting hadn't happened, and the mob-connected owner realized it was a fake, he might have hurt her. If she hadn't been able to sell her house quickly enough, the loan sharks might have killed her. They will say that setting a trap that could result in physical violence or federal prison time is a disproportionate response, and that I should have simply refused to give her the ring and let her deal with her bookies on her own. They argue that true professionals shouldn't stoop to the level of the criminals they expose. But there is a hard truth about dealing with malignant narcissists and addicts. They do not stop when you say no. If I had simply refused to give her the ring, Beatrice would have found another way. She would have broken into my house. She would have stolen my credit cards. She would have drained Greg's bank accounts. She was a desperate animal backed into a corner, and she was willing to sacrifice anyone to save herself. I didn't destroy Beatrice. I simply gave her exactly what she demanded and let her own arrogance do the rest. So, I will ask you this. If a toxic family member demanded your most prized possession to cover up their own dark, illegal secrets, would you have simply said no and waited for them to find another way to steal from you? Or would you have handed them a flawless fake, stepped back, and watched them walk confidently into a trap of their own making? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one.